Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I'm your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's jump right in and study some Jewish history together. We are continuing tonight with our discussion of the Nazis in Yimach Shemam, and tonight we will actually begin September 1939 with the outbreak of World War II. Now we're going to take the approach that William Schreier in his monumental work Rise and Fall of the Third Reich takes, and that tonight we're going to discuss the actual war, and next week, God willing, we will discuss the Holocaust. So World War II was really the last clear war. It was the last war where there was a clear good guy and a bad guy. There's a clearly one side that was evil and was out to destroy the world, and the allies that will rally against him will be those trying to save the world. Now, since then, every other war is, arguably up for discussion. Again, it's not always 100-0. It's sometimes 90-10. It's sometimes 80-20. But World War II was 100-0. That was the struggle that we had. Now, over the past few weeks, we've been discussing the background with the rise of Hitlerism, the moves that Hitler had made to essentially put into effect what he wrote in Mein Kampf, the abdication of the Treaty of Versailles, the annexing of Czechoslovakia, of the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, the annexing of Austria, the annexing of the German Rhineland, and to this point, no one had said boo. In fact, the British, as we mentioned in the Munich Agreement, actually agreed to let him take Czechoslovakia, even though Czechoslovakia didn't agree, but okay, that was what happened. So up until this point, it's really about Hitler calling the bluff of the Western world, because he'd already conquered vast swaths of land with barely even firing a shot. And what was he just going to be able to conquer all of Europe like this? Well, we'll see. But that's essentially what he thought was possible at this point. He thought that he was going to essentially force the Western world to call his bluff, and eventually they do, but it takes him quite a while. Now, the other factors that we have to mention in the lead up to World War II were from other parts of what became the Axis. First of all, Italy had invaded Ethiopia in 1935. We had the Spanish Civil War going on from 1936 to 1939. And even though the Spaniards never joined the Axis, they officially stayed neutral during the war. They are sympathetic towards the Axis and are in many ways allied with Hitler during the war. And the other piece of this is we have the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, and throughout the course of World War II, Japan will be trying to conquer different parts of China, and they will continue to be in a state of war throughout the war. There's also many Soviet-Japanese border disputes that have been going on for a long time at this point. We mentioned before the Sino-Russia War, that the Russians were badly embarrassed, that helped to bring on the first of the Russian revolutions in 1905, and a lot of those border disputes are still going on. So besides the rise of Hitlerism in Europe and him gaining vast swaths of land, starting to put his plan into effect, and by the way, when we talk about him gaining support of the German people, at the same time he's saving the German economy, partially by exterminating those lower class people who he cannot provide jobs to, and partially by putting into play the war machine that will help rebound the German economy, and partially by not paying the reparations of the Treaty of Versailles. Someone commented this week in my Today in Jewish History program that it was the reparations of World War I that caused World War II. And that was a piece, but as we've discussed these past few weeks, there were a number of pieces that led to the rise of Nazism and really the support of the German people behind Hitler, Yimach Shemo. Now, the German General Staff had learned their lessons from World War I. The now generals of the German army were the lieutenants of World War I, and they had learned their lessons. They studied World War I. They studied where the German people fell short because they planned for the take two. They planned for the repeat, and they didn't want to make the same mistakes the Germans made in World War I. So they were determined not to fight a trench war of attrition, and they developed their concept of the Blitzkrieg, which they had somewhat in World War I, but they put it into a word and into a plan in World War II, in which their idea was to basically hit their enemies with so much force, so much firepower, both in artillery and air force, etc., that before their enemies could even mobilize in some cases, or much less have any successful defense, they will have already won the battle. And that's the Blitzkrieg, and we see that the Blitzkrieg will initially be extremely successful in the first 2 years of the war. Beyond this, the German General Staff was not prepared to fight a two-front war. They knew that had they only had one front in World War II, at least in the beginning of World War II, they obviously did after 1917 when the Russians got out of the war, but had they only had one front to fight on throughout the war, they feel that they could have won. So they were determined not to fight a two-front war, which will ultimately be the undoing of Hitler. But they were determined to try and keep that from happening. So to make that happen, they knew they had to neutralize one of the fronts, and they knew it wasn't going to be the Western Front. They knew there was no way they were going to neutralize a front with the Western world, and therefore they looked towards the East for neutralization. Now, both Stalin and Hitler had been Yamach Shemo on both of them, by the way, because when we talk about Stalin and Hitler, if Stalin had lived in any other generation, he would have been the bloodiest dictator of all time, but because he started his career at the same time as Hitler, or really I guess had the main part of his career during the same time as Hitler, he's only number 2 as the second bloodiest dictator of all time, even though in numbers, because he was around for a lot longer than Hitler, he probably has more blood on his hands and more guilty on his conscience than Hitler had. But be it as it may, Stalin was really looking at the situation. Hitler was looking at the situation. Hitler felt he had a better chance with he knew he had no chance with the West, so he felt he had a chance with Stalin. And Stalin, then looking at who he was going to be allied with, he felt he had a better chance with Hitler than with France and England. Now, France, England, and Russia have been in all kinds of discussions to try and make a tripartite pact, but that fell apart and eventually didn't go anywhere. So, and now part of why that didn't go anywhere is because Stalin saw all these bluffs of the West. He felt the West was weak, the West was not ready for war, and after everything that we talked about, he said, I don't have a chance with the West. So therefore, he signaled to Hitler that he was ready to make a deal. Now, mind you, if you look at Mein Kampf and all of Hitler's early rhetoric for the first 6 years of his power, he had been railing against the communists, right? He almost hated the communists as much as he hated the Jews, or at least it sounded like it. Yet when there became an opportunity for him to come to an appeasement with the Russians, with the communists, he took the opportunity. Now, Stalin sends a signal to Germany that he's ready to talk, and what he does is he fires his foreign minister, who at that time was a Jew, as were many of the higher-ups in the Russian government at the time. And there's no reason to fire him. There's no reason at all. But that was a signal he sent to Germany that he was ready to have a discussion. So what transpired from this was that on August 23rd, 1939, we have something called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Molotov was the new Russian foreign minister. Yes, he's the one who is famous for inventing the Molotov cocktail. And we have Ribbentrop, who is the German foreign minister. And they make a pact in which Germany will give Russia all kinds of technology, because Russia's still trying to get into the 20th century at this point. And Russia, as is the case until today, is the monumentally large swaths of land that are part of the Russian Empire, the Russian country, whatever you want to call them at any point in history. But they have no shortage of natural resources. Hence a lot of the gas prices we've been paying during this Russian-Ukrainian war, because Russia is the largest supplier of oil in the world. Russia's the largest supplier of grain in the world and raw materials, and they were at that time also. So the part of the pact was that Germany would give Russia technology, Russia would give Germany the natural resources that they needed for war. And this was the official non-aggression pact between Ribbentrop and Molotov. But there was a secret pact that only was revealed to the public in the Nuremberg trials after the war. And essentially what it did was it divided up Russia between the Soviets and the Germans. In other words, there was already a plan that Russia would be attacked, and there's a plan that a plan that Poland would be attacked, and a plan that the Soviets would come in alongside the Germans, and that they would divide the lands into both the Soviet and the German spheres of influence across modern-day Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland, which would all be conquered and divided up between the Germans and the Russians. Now, this was a totally secret protocol, and like we said, no one officially knew about it until the Nuremberg trials after the war. Now, Stalin knew who he was dealing with Hitler, and knew what Hitler wanted in his extermination of the Jews. So he made sure that any of the areas with large Jewish populations went to the German sphere of influence. Hence the great death tolls that we're going to see of Polish Jewry, where almost all of Polish Jewry is going to be eradicated during World War II and the Holocaust. Now, Poland really thought they had an army. They had had certain military successes in between the Russian Revolution and the outbreak of World War II, and they thought they could do it. They had a very large army. They had the largest standing army in Europe at the time, but they were behind the times. They were fighting tanks with donkeys and machine guns with spears. That was essentially what they had, so that when Germany will come in, they will wipe them out very quickly. Now, they were also relying on France and England because they had made a pact with France and England that France and England will come to their defense if Germany were to attack them. Now, France and England, we're going to see, comes to their defense, but a little too late for the show. So this was a plan between the Germans and the Russians, and what it did was it neutralized the Eastern Front for the Germans. So the Germans could focus only on the Western Front when it was necessary. Now, when we talk about the pretext for war, because even Germany wanted to have some sort of pretext to go to war against Poland. So the controversy surrounded on the free city of Danzig. Danzig was a city that used to be part of the German Empire, and after the Treaty of Versailles was established as a free city, but it was basically part of Poland, and the Germans wanted it to be part of the German Empire once again because it was mainly a German-speaking area. And so a lot of the pretext that will lead to the outbreak of World War II will be around this piece of land and the pieces of territory that Hitler wanted from Poland. At least the pieces of property that went to Poland as part of the Treaty of Versailles. We're going to see really it was a plan to take over 60% of Poland. Now, on August 29th, Hitler makes demands of Poland that the Danzig should be handed over, and that there should be a plebiscite in other areas where there's a German minority to see if they wanted to be parts of Germany, and this was all types of demands that there's no way Poland was going to agree with. And of course, the Polish did not comply with the German demands, and it was clear they had been rejected. Now, beyond this, the Germans went through a plan to try and give themselves even more pretext for war, other than their ridiculous demands that no one would agree to. But they had a number of things that were referred to as Operation Himmler. And what they were is these were essentially setups or flag controversies, essentially where the SS, the secret police of the Germans, would stage different situations to look like the Germans had been attacked, when in fact it was the SS setting the whole thing up. The most infamous of these was the Gliwice radio station, which was a radio station on the German-Polish border, and the SS went in and sent out in Polish a pro-Polish message over the German radio waves, and at the same time they had Polish soldiers, actually prisoners from the Dachau concentration camp, which had already been established at this point, that they dressed up in Polish uniforms, and they were shot by the SS to look like they were shot by German soldiers after they had attempted to take over this radio station as a act of belligerency against the Germans. Again, the whole thing's staged, and there are a number of such situations set up throughout Germany, so that when Hitler would go on the airways to declare war against Poland, he would have this whole list of atrocities that they claimed that the Polish had perpetrated against the Germans, and none of them were true. They're all staged by Himmler and the SS. So with this being the situation, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, and the war was on. Now, it was a miscalculation on all parts, because France and England never really thought Hitler would invade Germany, and the Germans and Hitler never really thought France and England would do anything. Both are wrong. Hitler invaded Germany on September 1st, and on September 3rd, we see that France and England declare war on Germany. Now, at this point, the Germans become very nervous because first of all, it would have been two-front war, right? Because they're in Poland, and if France and France and England come in on the Germans' Western Front, then it's a two-front war, and they think they're in trouble. But the only problem was, even though France and England had declared war, they don't do anything for almost a year. As a lot of people said at the time, we had a blitzkrieg on the east and a sitzkrieg on the west. In other words, they were blitzing, the Germans were going in like crazy in Poland, and the French and British, even though they had declared war, they sat there and did nothing for close to 9 months before they ever do anything. And we'll see by that point, it is really too little, too late, because by that point Hitler has already totally destroyed Poland. He's run over the whole country within 6 weeks. He totally took it over. Stalin came into the war on September 17th, as their secret pact had established, and he took the pieces of Poland under the Soviet sphere of influence, and the other 60% went to Germany that was under the German sphere of influence. And by 6 weeks into the war, by November, you had Poland that ceased to be an independent country and was basically divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. Now, what's interesting is the areas that the Soviets conquered at that time are modern-day Ukraine and Belarus. So it's just kind of interesting when we think about the present-day war in the Ukraine, that they're still having that. It's the same battle that was being fought through the whole 19th and 20th century. It's still being fought today. So, as I often quote from George Santayana, that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. That's what we see going on. So if you really want to understand what's going on in between Russia and the Ukraine, just look at the past 300-400 years, because the war has just been repeating itself over and over again, really since the 1600s. So that's again, yes, we look at Russia as being the belligerents here, and the Ukrainians as being the victims here, and this time around that's true. But as I often say, and by the way, and we have to stand with the victims. I don't want to minimize that. We do need to stand with the Ukrainians during this war. But there's a long history there of the Jews in the Ukraine. Ukraine today is not exactly a philo-Semitic country. They have not stood by Israel. They have not stood by the Jewish people. That being said, there are a lot of Jews in the Ukraine, and this is one of the best regimes that Ukraine has been over probably since time immemorial. And but there's a lot of history. There are a lot of Jewish blood on the grounds of the Ukraine. So anyways, it's just same war, chapter, 27, and that's what happens here. So Ukraine goes to the Soviets, and that is the first 2 months of the war, really. Now, at this point, Hitler, once he's done with Poland, Hitler turns his attention to France. Now, after World War I, France had built something called the Maginot Line. Now, essentially, on the border between France and Germany, you have three things. You have Belgium, which played a role in World War I, that Belgium, the neutral country of Belgium, had stalled the Germans for a certain amount of time, because the Belgians fought the whole way. They slowed down the Germans enough for the French to mobilize, and it was really in many ways the difference in that war. Then you have the Ardennes Forest, which is a vast, vast forest that the French thought that you could not get military vehicles through. You cannot get tanks and armaments through that forest. They were wrong. We see the Germans do a very good job of going through the Ardennes Forest. And then the other part of the border, they built what's called the Maginot Line, named after General Maginot. And what this was, it was certain structures and cement structures and armaments, basically meant that if they would ever be attacked, first of all, military vehicles could not get through there, and there'd be enough armaments and enough traps and whatnot, that there's no way the Germans could ever get through the Maginot Line. They were wrong. It didn't work. None of this worked. The Germans go straight through Belgium. Belgium puts up no resistance this time. The Germans go through the Ardennes Forest, and the Maginot Line doesn't work. So everything crumbles down, and France is again, blitzed, completely overrun by the Germans, so much so that they were attacked May 10th, 1940, is when Germany will invade France. And it falls on June 14th. So 6 weeks, the great country of France, the military power of the 19th and 20th century, falls in a matter of 6 weeks to the Germans. And on June 22nd, they sign an armistice with Germany in the Compiègne Forest, which is where the armistice of World War I was signed. Now, this was choreographed all by Hitler, that it was signed in the exact same forest. They had the railway car of Ferdinand Foch, who was the head of the head of the French army during World War I, who had the Germans sign the armistice in World War I. So they brought Foch's railway car. He had Foch's chair, and Hitler flew in and sat in Foch's chair in the railway car in the Compiègne Forest to reenact, if you will, the armistice from World War I, and like an undoing of it, and now Germany was the victor. That's the propagandist of Hitler. There's no showman like Hitler in the world of that time. And this gives way to what we always say in my family, that on top of the Eiffel Tower they keep 3 flags. They have a French flag, a white flag, and a German flag, because they just don't put up a resistance. They were just totally surprised by the Germans and very quickly fall to the Germans and come to, now the French government, de Gaulle and court all flee, and most of the country becomes what's called Vichy France, which was officially neutral in the war, but was, again, like Spain, was allied with the Germans, and we'll see that that has its effect on French Jewry as well. Now, at this point, we see something interesting happen. On May 26, at that point, when the way that the Germans came in through coming through all of the fortifications and defense measures that didn't work on their western front, on the eastern border of France, the Germans came all the way to the English Channel and then swung back around, essentially taking over all the ports on the coast of France until they were about to get to a port named Dunkirk. And when one of the most debated decisions of the war, the German army halts their advance before going to Dunkirk. Reasons are debated as to if they were tired, they needed rest, they figured they'd already done so much, they could leave that, catch up a little bit and catch up on their supply lines and rest a little bit. But for whatever reason, they halt for 3 days before going to Dunkirk. And in those 3 days, it gives the Allies enough time to organize and put up a resistance at Dunkirk to be able to have an evacuation at the last free port in France at that point across the English Channel. They're able to put up a defensive line. And during that time, during that short period of 3 days, about more than 330,000 Allied troops, both in the British troops that come over to help the French troops that hadn't been killed or taken prisoner, they're able to escape across the English Channel. Now there are many heavy casualties, many drowned in the English Channel at that time. A lot of the equipment was left behind. There were around 16,000 French and 1,000 British soldiers that died in the evacuation, and all of their equipment. And it was not an easy battle, but it was regarded really as that battle, even though it was a defensive battle and a retreat, that's the battle that where the tide started to turn against the Germans. So when we look at Dunkirk, which took place only in the not even 1 year into the war, May 26th through June 4th, that's where the tide started to turn. Because had those 300,000 plus Allied troops not gone across the English Channel back to England, all would have been lost. I mean, who knows what would have happened to make the difference. So when Churchill, the Prime Minister, comes before the Parliament, he gets a standing ovation after the evacuation of Dunkirk. And he says the famous line at that point, "The victories are not made of retreats such as this." Meaning he knew that yeah, okay, we saved the army, but we have far from won the war. But really, if we look at it, at that point, that's when things started to change, because what happened at that point is now. By the way, one other interesting point from France is that France was able to keep their fleet as part of Vichy France, and on July 3rd, the United Kingdom sinks the fleet because they actually first demanded the fleet be turned over to the British. The French wouldn't do it, so the United Kingdom sinks the French fleet, the famous French fleet, because they were worried that it would fall into the hands of the Germans and be used against the British. So what happens in these next few months is that we have the Germans and the Italians with the North Africa and East Africa campaign taking over large swaths of Africa, and this is all after the fall of France, and Europe just crumbles a lot through treaty at this point, but all of Europe virtually falls to the Nazis, the Balkans, and the only thing that's left is Britain, right? The only resistance is Britain with whatever troops they got, the 20,000 or so troops from France, and that's the resistance. Now what happens is we have the Battle of Britain, we have the Blitz of the UK, and we have the Battle of the Atlantic, in which the German are trying to get the upper hand of the Atlantic Ocean. The German are bombing the heck out of England, and Britain is somehow surviving it all. It's interesting. We read books about the Blitz that went on in England that after a while it didn't even shake the spirit of the British people. It's like they expect, okay, at night we go to the bomb shelters, and then day we come out, and this is what's going to happen, and they went on with their lives. It's amazing how just the resilience of the human being, especially when you realize you're fighting good, you're good fighting evil, that you can stand up to that and really go on with your lives. And it's really just the resolve of the British people and Winston Churchill that really stood up to the Nazis in a time when all of Europe had fallen to the Nazis. And Churchill, there was no order in the 20th century, or probably maybe in all of time, like Winston Churchill, and he gave all the famous speeches in which he said he would battle, they would battle, the British Empire would battle till the end, and then if they end up in the sea, they go to whatever island they had, and even battle from there. And that's really what happens until we see a few other things happen that really should really turn the tides of the war. Now, Hitler was never able to mount a land invasion of Britain. Although he tried, the English Channel is not an easy body of water to get across, and Hitler's never able to mount a land offensive against the British, so it was only this air offensive. And the British Royal Air Force surprisingly does an amazing job against the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and just decimates the German Air Force. Even though the Blitz is crazy, we'll see the retaliation of the British Air Force against the German Air Force. It cripples the German Air Force, and to which in later parts of the war, they're a non-entity really in the war after the first year or so of the attacks from the Royal Air Force. Now, at this time, in America, we still had the staunch isolationism that had come in America after World War I. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew the whole, we talked before about his career had paralleled with Hitler. They came to power at a similar time. They were always in basically a chess match with each other, and Roosevelt knew that at some point he was going to have to confront Hitlerism in the world. So the first active step towards confronting Hitler was the Lend-Lease Act, in which America would lend military armaments to the British, to be paid later, to be paid after the war. And the idea, the famous metaphor that Roosevelt gave was that if my neighbor's house has a fire and I have a hose, of course I'm going to lend him the hose, even if I can't myself fight the fire. The idea being that if the neighbor's house catches on fire, then it's going to affect your house, and therefore if you have something that can help fight the fire, help fight the fire, even though you can't fight it directly. So that's what America does. They give Britain a number of battleships in the beginning, and then a number of armaments even before America ever gets into the war in an active way. Now, one of the factors that really hurts Hitler, similar to in World War I, what hurt the Germans was their alliances, and we see that happen again in World War II. Because Mussolini was, he had had his early successes in North Africa, Ethiopia, and he thought he was rebuilding the Roman Empire. The only problem was no one told the Italian army, and they never fight with any kind of resolve. They're able to take over people without armies or with minimal armies, but once they have any real resistance, they fall to pieces. And we see that happen when Mussolini invades Greece, and really throughout the early years of the war, Hitler is regularly going to have to come to the rescue of Mussolini, which is kind of interesting because Mussolini was really Hitler's role model. Mussolini was the first fascist to come to power, not including Stalin, so I guess maybe the second, but he came to power before Hitler, and the march on Mussolini's march was the inspiration for the beer house putsch, but at this point, his army was nothing to talk about, and Hitler's regularly having to go to bail out the Italians. Now, what's interesting is while the Germans are having tremendous success in North Africa, in Israel at this time, we have Israel still under the British mandate. We have a Jewish population there, and we have the Germans and the Italians will attack Israel a couple times during the war. They will bomb Tel Aviv, they'll bomb Haifa, and the story is told that the great Panovich Rav put down the cornerstone for the Panovich Yeshiva when the Germans were a few sand dunes away in North Africa, about 10 days away in Egypt, and people told him, like, what are you doing? You're building a yeshiva, you're starting to build a yeshiva when the Germans are going to take over Israel in 2 weeks' time. What are you doing? And he said, you know what, the Jewish people need a yeshiva even if it's only for 10 days. And it was that resolve of the Panovich Rav that led to the building of the great Panovich Yeshiva. I love telling the story of the Panovich Rav that he once went to Italy after the war, a lot later, on a fundraising mission, and he insists the night that he got to Italy, to Rome, to being taken to the Arch of Titus. Now, the Arch of Titus was the arch that was built after the destruction of the Second Temple by Titus, Yamach Shemo, the emperor that destroyed the Second Temple, and it was an arch celebrating the destruction of Yerushalayim and the destruction of Israel. So the Panovich Rav insisted to go there before going to his airport, before going to his hotel, and it was a rainy night in Italy, and he gets out of the car, and he looks up at the arch, and he says, Titus, Ich bin dur. He says, Titus, I am here, but where are you? As if to say, your empire is long since gone, yet the Jewish people are still here. And it was really that resolve, I believe, that the Panovich Rav used when he built the Panovich Yeshiva, when the Nazis, led by Rommel, the Desert Fox, were only 2 weeks away in North Africa. Now, Rommel finally, after his long string of successes, has it defeated by the hands of the British, and he's pushed back and never makes his way into the land of Israel. Now, the decisive misstep of Hitler was that he decides to invade his ally, Russia, right? Because to Hitler, contracts and treaties and pacts meant absolutely nothing. Now, what happened was Hitler saw that before the war, Russia had a skirmish with Finland, in which Finland stood their own against Russia. So, he thought, if they can't even fight Finland, of course they're not going to be able to stand up to Germany. And so what happens is, on June 22nd, 1941, Hitler unilaterally will break the pact with Germany, will terminate the pact with Russia, and will invade Russia, launching a massive attack on the Soviet Union and with something called Operation Barbarossa. And what's interesting, there's a couple interesting things here. First of all, the Germans were about a month late, and that's really the decisive issue, that Hitler had made his drop dead date for attacking Russia early May, knowing that they did not want to get caught by the Russian winter. And there were certain delays for whatever reason, and Hitler decided to push through, even though it was almost a month later than he was warned not to start. Now, Stalin had ignored repeated warnings that the Germans were going to invade. They had, there had been full-scale mobilization. The forces were mobilizing along the German-Russian border, aka Poland, and he just didn't think it was coming. And just to show how much he didn't think it was coming, is that the day before the attack, he sent his last train of materials into Germany, because that was the day of delivery. That was the day of the pact. And, he just never thought never saw it was coming. But the invasion, like in Poland, goes swift. Germany gains large territories of the Soviet Union. Basically everything that the Soviets had gained from the Poland were lost to the Germans within a few weeks, and the Germans make it almost all the way to St. Petersburg, to Moscow, and within 6 months, the Soviet military had suffered 4.3 million casualties. Another 3 million had been taken captive, and it looked like Stalin was about to have a nervous breakdown. It looked like there was no stopping the Germans. But then the one thing that always comes to the defense of the Russians came to the defense of the Russians, and that was the Russian winter, which the Germans were completely not prepared for that. First of all, they had these 1,000-mile long supply lines, and they had their soldiers fighting in the Russian winter wearing summer uniforms. Many froze to death. And the Soviets, they knew how to. They so to speak knew how to fight in a Russian winter. So Stalin will raise another 2 to 3 million troops, because there's two things that Russia has no shortage of. That's people and resources. And he's going to go through a military armament of 3 to 1 with the rest of the Allies are doing. And like this, slowly but surely, he'll be able to push back the Germans. Now, it won't be immediate. The Germans will come back in 1942 and almost once again conquer Moscow. But the Russians will push them back once again. And after that second time, there's not going to be a third time. So really by the beginning of 1942 into 1941, beginning of 1942, it's clear that the war is over. It's just really a matter of time. Now, the piece of the puzzle that really sways the war decisively for the Allies happened on December 9th, 1941, a day that'll live in infamy. And what happened was the Japanese had been threatened by rhetoric with the Americans, and there were many of American and British installations throughout the Pacific Ocean, and Japan felt that they didn't want to be bullied by the West anymore. They wanted to have full control of the Pacific, but they knew they could not win a long war against the Americans and the British, so they decided they had to have a military attack in which they could win the whole war in one day. And that was December 9, 1941, that not only was the military base at Pearl Harbor attacked with nearly 3,000 American soldiers being killed, but many other American and British installments throughout the Pacific were attacked on that day or in subsequent days. And again, it was a blitz. It was America and Britain didn't see it coming, and the Japanese had tremendous initial success in the Pacific War. So of course, on that day, America declares war on Japan, but not on Germany. But Germany, out of solidarity with the Japanese, declared war back on America, and therefore America declares war on Germany. And on that day, Roosevelt sends a cable to Churchill saying, "Today all of us are in the same boat, and it is a ship which will not and cannot be sunk." And Churchill wrote in his diary that night he went to sleep he said, "I slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful." Because as much as Churchill had been hoping, praying, prodding, trying to get America into the war, trying to get Roosevelt into the war, until once it actually happened, even though it was only December 1941 at this point, there's 3.5 more years to fight the war, but Churchill knew it was over. It was just going to be a matter of time, and unfortunately, how many lives would be lost. Now, the decisive battle that really turns the tide in the Pacific is a battle for a little island that's no more than 2 miles squared called Midway. It's midway between North America and Asia, between basically America and Japan, or America and Russia, really, and that's why it's called Midway. It's near the Hawaiian Islands, but it's not part of Hawaii. It's not incorporated as an island. It's a little piece of land, 2 miles squared with an airstrip and a few houses, and that's it. And it's interesting how it even became part of America. And that happened when William Seward was the Secretary of State, and he was the Secretary of State in the Lincoln administration, and he had certain imperialistic visions for America. He thought that America needed to expand their territories, and his visions of gaining territories only had success in two areas. One was the annexing of this small 2 mile square island of Midway, and the second was the purchase of Alaska in 1867 for $7.2 million. Now, it's interesting if you think about it, because the decisive battle in the Pacific happens at Midway. What happened was the Japanese were planning a sneak attack on Midway. And had they attacked Midway with Pearl Harbor still being not at full throttle, there would have been nothing stopping the Japanese from coming onto mainland America. And the Americans find out about this battle, this planned sneak attack through their decoding department, and they even set a trap because they weren't sure it was Midway. They thought it might be Midway, but they set a trap to determine that yes, it was in fact Midway, and they were able to have a successful offensive before the Japanese came in and attacked Midway, and that really turned the tide in the Pacific. And from that point, for the next 3 years, it was unfortunately a slow and dirty process to win the Japanese. And the battles were dirty because the Japanese culture was to fight till the end. The idea of the kamikaze pilot, the idea of fighting, you don't give up, you don't surrender, and that was what they saw in it was an island by island fight, and everyone was bloody with not even trenches. We're talking underground tunnel fortresses that the Japanese had built on every single island throughout the Pacific that they had control of, and the Americans implement the nasty weapon of napalm, which was fire bombs, basically, where we talk about the atomic bombs, which killed about 100,000 Japanese, but the napalm that was used during World War II and again later in Vietnam, it kills a lot more and is a lot more brutal. Just burned out Tokyo and many other towns throughout Japan, and what happens, what will happen in Japan is just brutal. But the end of the war finally comes after it drags itself out for another 2.5, 3 more years, as Germany is slowly but surely being squeezed on two fronts. We have the Battle of Normandy, where America lands troops in France, mounts a successful offensive there, pushing back and landing troops on mainland Europe. Once that happened, the war was basically over. It would take another year, but on June 6, 1944, we had the Battle of Normandy. Before that, Americans were in North Africa. So you have America and England fighting from the west. You have the Russians fighting from the east. America and England fighting from the west and North Africa. Russia fighting from the east, slowly but surely closing in on Germany and taking back the lands that had been conquered by the Nazis, Yamach Shemam. Now, the Germans never really understood the lay of the land, because they really thought that if the push came to shove, that America would look at the Soviets as worse enemies than the Germans. That America and Germany were more similar than America and Russia. So they really thought that at some point that America would sue for peace with the Germans, and then they together would go in and attack Russia. That's really what they thought until the end. But they never really understood the concept of unconditional surrender, what was happening, until like almost all was lost, and the Soviets were pouring into Berlin, and the Nazi leadership, Hitler and others, were in the Führer's bunker, where eventually Hitler commit suicide, bringing about the end of the war. So just the last few weeks of the war saw many, many interesting events. On April 12th, 1945, President Roosevelt dies. Now, what's interesting is that Roosevelt had earlier that year been elected, or earlier that year had been sworn in to a fourth term. But what was interesting is in his first 3 terms, his vice president was Vice President Wallace, who was, in modern terms, we'll call him a progressive. In the terms of the 40s, he was probably somewhat close to being a Soviet or communist, not Soviet, but a communist sympathizer. And by this point, even though the public didn't know it, Roosevelt was already very sick. So there were operatives in the Democratic Party who felt that it was not a smart idea to have Henry Wallace as the vice president for a 4th term of FDR, where FDR, if nature had his way, probably would not live out that term. Now, no one thought it'd only be a few months, but they figured they better have a more basically inconsequential character in place, and that's what they were striving for. They weren't trying to put a great leader. They weren't trying to put a great revolutionary. They were trying to put basically a non-entity as vice president. Unlike Wallace, who was a little bit of radical to the left, they wanted a non-entity there, so that if Roosevelt was indeed to die during his presidency, this non-entity would become president, and it'd be whatever it is. In this case, it's 3.5 years, but okay, it'd be 3.5 quiet years. The other powers of the Democratic Party and the president's cabinet could lead the country, and then they could elect him out of office after that term. So they chose the senator from Missouri, Harry S. Truman, and we'll talk more about him in subsequent episodes of what he meant to the Jewish people. But in that event, they ended up changing the course of world history, because while they thought they were putting some non-entity into the vice presidency and possibly presidency, he ended up being one of the greatest presidents of all time and making some truly monumental decisions and being a truly great president, which none of those who propelled him into place ever saw coming. Now, just to show how much of a non-entity he was, that when he was nominated, he had only met Roosevelt once before, and Roosevelt couldn't even remember his name initially. That was the situation with Truman. But on April 12th, Roosevelt dies. Truman becomes vice president. And on April 28th, Benito Mussolini is killed. Now, Mussolini had already actually been overthrown because the Allies had conquered Italy, part of Italy. Then the Germans, again, going to try and bail out Mussolini, conquered part of it back, put Mussolini as a puppet governor on the throne. But on April 28th, he is killed by Italian partisans. On April 30th, Hitler commits suicide in the Führer's bunker. And at that point, it's finally time for unconditional surrender. It's signed on May 7th and 8th, bringing an end to the European theater of the army. Now, there was the German army group in Prague that continued to fight until May 11th, but as of May 11th, the war is completely over in Europe. Now, but the problem is we still have the war on the Pacific, because we still have that Japanese culture of fighting till the end, kamikaze pilots, suicide bombing, not surrendering, all that went into effect. to which enters the Manhattan Project. Now, many of the powers of the world have been working on the idea of a nuclear bomb, an atomic bomb. This was not a new concept. In fact, the Germans in the early part of the war had been working on it. And if they hadn't expelled all the Jews that went to work on the Manhattan Project, they might have even gotten an atomic bomb, because you can only imagine what Hitler with an atomic bomb would have meant for the world. But America is the one that is able to basically achieve the discovery of the atomic bomb. They build a number of atomic bombs. They build two styles. There's one that they call Little Boy, and one that they call Big Daddy. Just different types. One was uranium, one was plutonium. And on August 6th, the Little Boy version of the bomb is dropped on the city of Hiroshima. Now, there are a number of cities being considered, all cities that had a number of conditions. The conditions were they had to be important to the war effort of the Japanese, and they had to have not been previously attacked by the Allies. So the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and after that bomb was dropped, the Prime Minister Suzuki of Japan said the Japanese government would not follow the Potsdam Pact, which was the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender. And Prime Minister Suzuki said even after Hiroshima that they would fight on. So 3 days later, the Fat Man version of the bomb was dropped in Nagasaki, another city fulfilling those qualifications. And it was just a devastating 1-2 punch to the Japanese. There were between 90 and 146,000 people who were killed in Hiroshima, and between 39 and 80,000 killed in Nagasaki. Half of that was in the first day that the bombs were dropped. The rest were in the subsequent people dying from the burns, radiation, sickness, injuries compounded through malnutrition. The 90% of the medical establishment in these cities was knocked out, and it was very clear that things were not looking good for the Japanese. So. Now, what happened in the aftermath was that Truman made a speech to the American people saying they spent $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and they won. And he also, MacArthur, General Marshall, the head of the war in the Pacific, had put forth, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had put forth plans to make more bombs, and he was told that the bombs would be ready on August 19th. So there's a plan to continue to bomb these Japanese war centers, essentially, the cities that were significant to the war effort, until the Japanese would surrender. And the plan was to drop the next one on August 19th. But finally, on August 15th, the emperor had mercy on his people, and on August 15th, the Japanese finally surrender, and they signed armistice on the American battleship USS Missouri, which was in the Tokyo Bay. That's signed on September 2nd, and that finally ends the bloodiest war of world history, and a war that had monumental effects on the world and catastrophic, irrevocable effects on the Jewish people, of which we will talk about more next week as in a Seres Yemei Tshuva topic. So if you need something to help to get you in mindset for Yom Kippur and the fact that we're all mortals here on earth, that'll be our discussion for next week. But for the end of this week, I just would like to wish you all a Kasiva v'Chasima Tova. We should all be written and sealed in the book of life for an amazing year ahead of us, all with good things for you and your entire family, and I look forward to learning with you throughout the coming year of 5783. I wish you a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and a wonderful Yontiv, and a wonderful year. Thank you so much for coming.